Now, you did just publish a video that I found fascinating of old Incan ruins that a researcher effectively was able to use the language that was sort of imprinted in these ruins on the walls, perhaps. You can expound on that. And he was later able to use it as a computer language.
Yeah.
This is bizarre to me. So can you just lay it out from front to back,
absolutely.
sort of how these discoveries were made and how this researcher eventually was able to create computer code with it?
His name, Anyway, Guzman. His name is Ivan de Guzman, and he was a mathematician, and he was working with the Aymara children, teaching them in the late 70s, teaching them to speak Spanish.
And this is in Peru.
And in Peru, correct. And he noticed that, and teaching them mathematics, and he noticed that they had that for some reason, all the Aymara children, if the number was 2 times 3, they would expect it to have a different answer than 3 times 2. But everybody else got that this was the same thing, just inverted. They weren't seeing that. So he recognized there was something unique in the culture of the language. So he started studying it. And what he realized was there was a few key features that made the language uniquely suitable for what he ended up making was a computer language translator. It was the very first multi-language translating program available. It would translate like Spanish and English and Portuguese and Aymara and a few others, but it used Aymara as the bridge language. And this was in like 83 that this first was made. I mean, this competed with Google Translate all the way to like 2010, 2016, something like that. It was, and this had very little money put into it by comparison. And you still have to add words to the dictionary, to the lexicon of the thing. But basically, the language had a few key features. One of them was it never varies its syntax. So it always is subject, object, verb. And that never changes, even if they incorporate a saying from another culture. It's subject, object, verb, always. The language is like 3-point logic. It's at the end of each sentence, there is the suffix that denotes whether or not it is yes for sure or maybe, or if it's for sure or maybe. So it gives you 3 points where you have either yes for sure, no for sure, or maybe. The language has a lot of puns in it, and that allowed for it to have some ambiguity. And and it was a long-lived language that had very, very little change over a long period of time. So when he plugged all that in together, and he started working on the language, it's called Atamari, Atamari is the computer language, or the computer software. And it was the premier multi-language software, translating software for quite a while. CompuServe messed around with it in the late 90s and stuff. And he had funding issues and whatnot, and it still ended up being oddly, uniquely capable of working with the computer, which was really, really weird to me.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, obviously doing linguistic translation is difficult cross cultures because obviously, as you were mentioning, the syntax of these sentences are structured differently. Mm-hmm. That you couldn't just take an English sentence and then convert it into Japanese, because the way that the subjects and verbs and nouns are all reorganized. You couldn't just do a one-to-one translation, because even though you'd have the words that line up, the sentence wouldn't have the same meaning because it's all out of order. And so you would have to have some type of unique algorithmic mechanism in order to reorder things. And for whatever reason, this specific root language was able to organize the sentences way more effectively. I mean, I think you had even mentioned in the video was able to do 700 words a second.
Yeah, that was what that was like. I forget the megahertz of the hard drive or the processor he's talking about, but it was like a Pentium 3. We're talking like 20 years ago, man. At 700 words a second was not yesterday. That was like early 2000s.
And they found inscriptions of this language in like all of these.
Aymara's, I don't know about inscriptions of Aymara, to be honest with you, but it is the locally spoken dialect of the people that are descended from the Inca, and it's been in the mountains of Peru and in Bolivia. It is the native tongue. And it's all, I mean, there's one other interesting thing about it. There's like half a dozen different regional dialects, right? And like you go to China and you got a bunch of different regional dialects too. Even here in the States, you have a bunch of different regional dialects. And if I go down to the deep South, sometimes I have a hard time understanding people, right? all of their regional dialects are easily understood by other people over there. And as a quick aside, what's interesting is those same people have had to go through quite a bit. All of the foods that they eat are really high in alkali, almost all of the tubers that they eat, the potatoes and stuff, and they've had to have all kinds of little kooky ways for them to process their foods. Now, it's normal for people to figure that stuff out, but it's just weird. It's like there's all this like proto-science things that are happening up in the hills of Bolivia that just seem a little out of place, and then you start looking at places like Tiwanaku, which the water and stuff in some of these places, the way that they worked with water. There's a thing called a hydraulic jump. It's if you take a slow moving body of water and a fast moving body of water and pour them into each other, the one that comes down, the faster one will lose momentum and use that to gain altitude. So then there's places in Tiwanaku where they've got a hydraulic jump where one water will jump over the other and they flow. One's flowing to the left and one's flowing to the right, and they've got two opposing streams with a rock over the top of them, and one jumps on top of the other rock. It's very impressive, and they're not the only ancient people to figure out hydraulic jumps, and they also had some metallurgy, and they also use those same iron clamps, the same metal clamps to bond their masonry that we see in the old world. There's just a whole lot of little things that Bolivia, Easter Island, that part of the world's the parts that I'm most interested in when I start looking, just besides Egypt. Egypt is almost just duh, right?
Oh, that's interesting. And what would these hydraulic jumps have been used for?
Just to make water go different directions and stuff. Just that area is not only is it a water temple, basically, but it's also a water reservoir. There's a lot of there was a study, I wish I had it on me off the top of my head, sorry. But there was a study that they did where there's a lot of water that would get locked in the bedrock or in the loose fill that was put underneath one of the pyramids there. I forget which one, sorry. And anyway, that gets channeled into a whole bunch of water, and a lot of that got channeled into neighboring areas where they've done some looking into it and found where this was basically a starting point for feeding water into a lot of the farmlands in the surrounding area. So it's possible the hydraulic jumps were part of that. It's more likely it was just for show. That it's like, because they could have just had the water go whatever direction they wanted, but it's like, hey, or it's symbolic, or the old archaeological excuse, it was religious. But right, but for some reason they did it when they could have just put them going side by side next to each other, and it would have been less work. But So to me, there are reasons to use hydraulic jumps, but there's none that I saw there that makes sense as like on a functional level.
Oh, that's interesting. And I don't want to loop back too far, but I thought this was an interesting point on the linguistics element that this was something that was not apparent to me, that linguistics and the way that a language is actually structured changes sort of the epistemology of a culture, that the way people can understand knowledge and information is so much bound by the language. And obviously there's little examples of, like words existing or not existing. And that's just kind of like a surface level example that, different cultures will have words for things that we may not have. And as a result, they have sort of a connection with these ideas that we might not have in the same way. But an interesting one that just kind of came up as you were saying it, I remember reading that the judicial system in Japan actually has different sentencing very often, and the way that they view crime, according to one linguist, was dependent on sort of how the language structured sentences when it came to crime. So in the United States, human beings do crime. You know what I mean? Like, you have been convicted of this crime. Like, you stole from someone. And it was having you as like sort of this subject doing an action of an offense. Whereas I believe, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong, the way that the Japanese language is set up, it will be the verb that is then carried out by a facilitator. So it'll be, a crime was done, and this person happened to be the person that had carried it out. And obviously they understand it, intellectually as, this person did the crime, of course. But in the way that judges will be sentencing people, this linguist hypothesizes that they have a different judicial system because they see crimes as almost existing ontologically, and then people carry out the crimes. So they almost see the people as, secondary to the offense happening. So as a result, they get sentenced comparatively, more mercifully. Whereas in the United States, it's like you did something wrong, and so they get sentenced with harsher punishments because the person carried out this act.
That's interesting.
Which is just an interesting way, when looking at sort of how languages possess knowledge, and how, even in this example, the language is able to extract and deduce a lot of information for other translations. It is interesting to think how much information and knowledge was even lost in the, sort of, dithering of, ancient languages.